Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for listening to this talk. My name is Dr. David McCollum, and I'm a lecturer in migration studies at the University of Cambridge. So the focus of this talk and today's conference is thinking about social mobilities. I'm a geographer. I'm most interested in thinking about how social mobility impacts on basically people's life chances, how they get on in life. In the talk this afternoon, I'll focus on three things. I'll start off thinking about how we might understand the relationship between moving upwards and moving geographically from both a theoretical and methodological point of view. I'll then talk about some research that we've recently been doing using understanding society, which of course is the point of this conference. And then I'll finally think about the next steps in terms of the research. So in terms of maybe a useful starting point, this diagram perhaps is quite basic, hopefully helps to understand how we conceptualize social mobility and the geographical factors that might impact that. So of course, we've got all the factors that contribute to our life chances, our age, our gender, etc. And then, of course, as a geographer, what we might try and do is think about how geographical factors, whether they be on the global scale, local scale, or indeed regional scale, how these kind of interact with each other to impact people's ability to get on. So starting from that kind of quite basic premise, then we can therefore think about the idea of social hierarchies, people's position within society, and how people move up and down the social ladder based on various factors, including geographical factors. Trying to understand this, I quite like Danny Dorning's work, particularly his diagrams around the idea of ladders of inequality. You can see the image here, where, of course, within any society, you've got inequalities. It's maybe impossible or undesirable to have completely equal societies. However, what Danny Dorning's usefully thought about in his research, I think, is to look at the extent to which these ladders are steep or otherwise. And we can also think about rungs along those ladders in terms of how hard or how difficult it is, excuse me, for people to move up and down those ladders. So if you look at the image here, you can see the steep ladders with lots of rungs on it, and people don't look particularly happy on this ladder. Whereas the less steep ladder, of course, most people within that society seem to be happier and have better outcomes in various levels. So of course, we're going to think about the relationship between basically people's position within society and the propensity of people to move up and down strata in society. Of course, as I'm sure you're familiar with, there's a long history of research within the social sciences on this particular issue. And of course, we can think about why this is the case. Ultimately, people's ability to move up and down social hierarchies is ultimately a question of fairness, of social justice. And of course, if you want to be more kind of hard-nosed about it, you can think about it in terms of economic productivity as well. There's a waste of people's talents if they're not able to realize those to their full extent. And of course, more recently, there's been an increasing body of evidence looking at the implications of unequal societies. Most famously, perhaps, would be the Spirit level, which came out just over 10 years ago, which basically argues that inequality is not just bad for the people at the bottom of the social hierarchy, but it basically harms all elements of society. So despite from a political or a social science point of view and a policy point of view, a lot of interest, quite understandably, in inequality and social mobility, but remains to a large extent quite a multifarious concept, quite difficult to actually pin down in some respects exactly what we're talking about. On one hand, we can think about changes across generations. This is intergenerational mobility. This is basically thinking about how people get on in life compared to their parents' generation or even generations before that. We've also got the concept of intra-generational mobility, which is thinking about comparing individuals across their life courses. Okay, and of course, to think about this, the most common approach to doing that would be thinking about changes in people's occupational status over time, and that's what the focus of much of the content in this talk is going to be on. So in terms of in terms of occupational mobility, as I just said, this is quite often one of the main ways in which social mobility is defined. And of course, thinking back to that diagram a few moments ago, we can think about the various factors at the individual scale which impact on changes in occupational status. we can think about age, sex, education, socioeconomic status, etc. And of course, when we think about data sets on the society, to a large extent, these are quite amenable analysis. However, as we know, other factors, probably more intangible factors, also have quite a significant impact naturally on people's ability to basically get on in work and therefore in life. So we can think about basically personality traits, the extent to which people are ambitious in their careers, and basically the values they have around work and home life, etc., which of course have a big impact on people's occupational experiences. However, of course, from from an empirical research point of view, these issues and factors are inevitably prone to what we call the method variable problem, which means, of course, it's hard to pick these apart and identify them using statistical data. So those are some of the individual level factors that, of course, are going to impact on the extent to which people move on in their careers. We can think about place-based determinants as well. This is thinking about the extent to which where someone works either makes it harder or easier to basically get on in their careers. So we can think about the size of the settlements that people work in, and the literature tells us that basically bigger cities, for various reasons, are much more conducive to occupational mobility than smaller places are. We can think about the buoyancy of local labour markets. So more buoyant labour markets provide more opportunities for upward occupational mobility. And then thinking about kind of to the global scale, we can think about basically where cities sit on this hierarchy of global cities in terms of kind of elite career opportunities as well. There's a little bit about how we can think about occupational mobility. Of course, from an empirical point of view, there remain many challenges in terms of how we kind of grapple with it. First of all, we can think about how we actually empirically define occupational change. I'll say more about that in a second. We can also think about the availability of suitable longitudinal data to actually understand and follow people's careers through time. And then finally, of course, when we're trying to look at the determinants of occupational mobility, some of those are intangible. And of course, when we think about individual level characteristics versus place-based determinants, picking those apart in a statistical sense can be very, very challenging as well. That's a little bit about occupational mobility. So of course, whenever we're thinking about that, we logically think about the extent to which spatial mobility interacts with people's occupational change through time. I suppose the key thing here from a migration perspective is to emphasize the point that migration is ultimately a very, very spatially and socially selective process. What that means is that, of course, not everyone has an equal chance of becoming a migrant, and where people move to is not a completely random process. So what we tend to find is people who are young, people who have invested a lot in their human capital, people who are ambitious are much more likely to move for economic reasons than people who aren't. And of course, people who have those characteristics are inevitably attracted to the types of places which offer the best return on their skills and their investment in their education. So when we're thinking about the relationship between social and spatial mobility, of course, and naturally we might think about Tony Fielding's kind of classic work on the escalator region paradigm. And looking at Tony Fielding's work, he talks about identifying key escalators, in his context, London and the wider southeast, as being magnets internally and for international migration as well, for those who have the greatest promotion potential. And of course, that's kind of that idea has been around now for nearly 40 years. But there's a lot of issues which kind of remain unresolved. So, for example, is it the migrants themselves who people who move to these areas who particularly benefit from being there, largely as a consequence of being particularly motivated and having relatively high skills relative to non-migrants in those areas? We can think about, is it everyone within the escalator regions who benefit from its effects? There's still some uncertainty around the question of whether it's just certain sectors within escalator regions which produce these very, very rapid rates of career progression. Or is it simplistic perhaps to think about single escalator regions within an economy? Of course, we can think about different levels of escalators happening there. Then finally, I published a paper a few years ago in Regional Studies, which was basically thinking about the extent to which where someone lives or where someone works that has the biggest impact on their career progression. And of course, if we're analysing these kind of things at a regional level, then of course, whether you look at where they live or where they work is fairly inconsequential. However, if you're looking at finer geography, of course, we can basically think about place of work being ultimately more important than place of residence. And this is probably has implications if we're thinking about global cities where housing is expensive and we have longer distance commuting into and out of those particular places. There's lots of attention on these types of questions over the last decades, and to the extent some of these remain unresolved. What's received probably much less attention is the extent to which spatial mobility sometimes is related to downward occupational mobilities. I'll say more about that in a second. In relation to our understanding society analysis, we can think about immobilities, as I'll demonstrate also in a moment. Most people don't move occupationally or socially through time. And we can also perhaps think about basically what the relationship between social mobility and remaining in or moving to more economically peripheral regions, how that kind of dynamic plays out as well. So I've said a little bit about occupational mobility, what that is, some of the challenges around finding that. I've talked a little bit about spatial mobility, it being an inherently socially and spatially selective process. And I'll talk a little bit now about basically the relationship between these two things. The UK, as I'm sure you're familiar with, has some of the most significant regional inequalities within Europe. But of course, many other places globally experience large and significant regional inequalities as well. So what that means for people is that in many cases, spatial mobility is inevitably a precursor to social mobility. So someone resides in a place which doesn't offer ample opportunities for social mobility, inevitably people have to move to those places which do offer it. And we can look at this kind of relationship in a positive or less positive light. In terms of opportunity, we can think about it from a human capital perspective. We can think about people who are young, who are skilled, who are ambitious, naturally and logically moving to places which offer increased opportunities for career progression. On a slightly less positive note, we can think about people having to move out of necessity. So for some population subgroups, the literature points perhaps to women and ethnic minority groups, some of those people having to move to escalator regions because of a lack of opportunities where they currently are. We can perhaps think about escalator regions in these two different lights in that case. So of course, that's a little bit about kind of conceptually how we might try and think about these relationships from a more practical methodological point of view. If we accept that social and spatial mobility in theory are intertwined, the logical question there is therefore to try and understand how that's the case. And of course, this literature, body of literature is a few decades old. It's still largely unresolved in some ways, and this probably relates to some key challenges, some key questions around how we understand the social spatial mobility nexus. So first of all, we can ask the question: what is social mobility in empirical terms? Some of the key challenges in this respect would be the crudeness of the socioeconomic status categories. I'll say more about that in a second in our data from understanding society, and of course the problem of ceiling effects. So if we've got the 7 or 8 kind of main national statistics socioeconomic classifications, of course there's lots of heterogeneity within that. So moving from one to another is quite crude. Likewise, when we're trying to understand escalator effects, a key challenge there is that many people are quite near the top or at the top before they even move. So they're moving from a very good or quite a good job to a slightly or even better one. But of course, picking that up in empirical terms can be very, very difficult as well. So how do we define what we're interested in? Key challenge. Second key challenge is to try and understand and identify appropriate data that allows us to capture occupational change through time. On one hand, we've got census-based longitudinal studies. So we can think about, for example, the Office for National Statistics longitudinal study going back to 1971 up until 2011. Hopefully in a few years' time we'll have access to the more recent census as well. And of course, these represent a wonderful opportunity to take a longer-term view on how social mobility is changing through time. However, of course, as I'm sure you're familiar with, a real challenge with these data sets is we've got 10-year gaps where from a research point of view, we have little to no information about people's occupational status or their mobility behaviours and experiences. And of course, that's a key challenge. On the other hand, we've got longitudinal surveys, Understanding Society being an obvious example, where we've got really rich data on an annual basis about where people live and what jobs they're doing. But of course, there are problems there around sample size and the representativeness of that sample, particularly over time. And the third key challenge when we're trying to understand the social spatial mobility nexus would be causality, the direction of causality. So basically, what comes first and what causes does social mobility lead to spatial mobility or vice versa? So there we've got some real challenges, I think, around basically thinking about the timing and the ordering of occupational and spatial mobility. So this is some of the kind of key questions and key challenges which have kind of hampered research in this area for quite a while. So in terms of what I'll talk about now, I'll talk a little bit about research we've been using Understanding Society to try and grapple with some of these answers, these questions. So as I'm sure you're familiar with, Understanding Society has some real benefits when we're trying to understand social mobility. We can look at occupational and residential statuses at very regular annual intervals. It gives us information on people's job and also the residential experiences and preferences on an annual scale. In terms of the time scale that's covered with Understanding Society, we don't necessarily quite get the Great Recession, but we can certainly cover the period of austerity which followed it. And we can look at Brexit and how that might impact on residential mobility and occupational change. And finally, of course, Understanding Society had the special COVID wave surveys as well, which is a real opportunity to understand some of the impacts of that momentous event. So in terms of the analysis we're going to talk about now, mainly draws on wave 3 up until wave 10. And we basically look at occupational change across 2 consecutive waves for all people aged 16 plus. So that gives us about 1/3 records, which we can analyse. We also included some kind of lower geographies as well, particularly to try and understand things like local levels of deprivation and how they kind of interact with residential and occupational change. So in terms of what we included in our analysis, we at this stage went for a quite crude analysis of occupational mobility. So you can see the diagram here, 7 being occupational categories using the Office for National Statistics, so socioeconomic status indicator, and also full-time students as well. So basically, upward mobility is someone moving up the hierarchy, downward mobility is someone moving down it, and immobility is people staying within their main socioeconomic status across 2 consecutive waves. In terms of residential mobility, that people changing the postcode address since the previous wave, and you can look and you can see basically the kind of as the normal covariates you would expect in our modelling to try and understand what determines occupational change. So in terms of key questions, for the purposes of this short presentation, I'll focus on 2 things. So first of all, are movers more upwardly socially mobile than non-movers? And secondly, what characterises these so-called escalator movers? So the first thing I would show you when it comes to our data would be, first of all, the profile of the labour market across our period of analysis. And I suppose an interesting thing here to note might be the remarkable extent to which occupational structures are quite static over that whole period. So you can see that consistently about 1/3 of the labour force are in the top 2 categories over the almost 10-year period that we're looking at. And this kind of connects to that previous point I made about the challenges around ceiling effects. So if we're thinking about the logic around escalator regions, we're thinking about a lot of people who are already quite near the top moving somewhere else for the purposes of career progression. To what extent does our rather crude analysis allow us to kind of pick up on that? And that's kind of an unresolved issue, I think, from our point of view. So we can see basically here, looking at this diagram, we can look at circular plot to try and understand the extent to which mobilities do change. And of course, circular plots like this, they look quite nice, but they don't necessarily help us that much when we're trying to understand occupational change. The key point I would make here is that mobilities across occupational categories are relatively modest, and most people remain within their occupational group between consecutive years in understanding society. So we can look at here is basically some analysis we've done to look at basically what impacts people's chances of upward occupational mobility. There's lots going on here, so I'll just try and kind of emphasize the key points. First of all, the thing we would say is that movers are much more upwardly mobile than non-movers. In terms of geography, those moving to or moving within the southeast of England seem to experience good opportunities for upward mobility as well. Renters, people who cohabit, young people, and men all seem to have very good odds of upward occupational mobility as well. Interestingly, the non-white group has better chances of upward mobility than the white group, which is maybe something we might reflect on in the discussion. And that's a little bit about occupational mobility. In terms of mobility, you can see the chart here showing that every year, depending on the population you look at, about just fewer than a tenth of people change address according to our data. It's interesting to note we perhaps see a slight decline in rates of residential mobility through time, and that's a point I'll return to at the end of the talk in terms of thinking about going forward, what might happen in terms of social mobility and what might happen in terms of how we try and study it. What we can see here is basically we can see the relationship between residential mobility and occupational mobility. What you can see is basically most people don't move at all during that period. But what we can see is that all the people who are spatially mobile, we can see an increased propensity to also be occupationally mobile as well. If you look at the bar on the right-hand side, you can see that people who move have a greater chance of experiencing upward occupational mobility. It's also interesting to note at the left-hand side as well. We can see people who are spatially mobile have greater chance of moving downwards occupationally than people who don't move as well. So there's something interesting going on there. So if you move, you're more likely to move up, but you're also more likely to move down than people who are immobile. And that's maybe worth something that we could reflect on perhaps as well. You can see in the graph here that people who are the graph here simply reiterates the point. Particularly movers in a spatial sense are much more likely to be movers in a social mobility sense as well. Okay, so next, now that we've kind of confirmed that movers are more occupationally mobile, upwards and downwards, we can look at the factors that basically determine the characteristics of these escalator movers. So again, here you can basically see the odds ratios of the chances of the effect that moving has on your occupational outcomes. There's lots going on here, so basically use the next few slides to try and identify some interesting trends. So first of all, it's interesting perhaps to note that for men, moving seems to have a particularly significant impact on occupational moves. So we see basically for men who move spatially, that has a positive impact on moving upwards. Excuse me. Whereas for female movers, that effect is much more modest. Another interesting thing to note would be that younger people get a lot more from moving than people in other age categories. And again, that kind of what we might expect from the literature so far. We can also think about the effect of education level. As you'd expect, people with degrees have much higher rates of upward mobility, regardless of whether or not they move. But moving has a much greater impact on upward mobility for degree holders versus non-degree holders. And again, this is the sort of things that I expect from academics so far. Another thing which is interesting to look at from a geographical point of view is to think about the relationship between upward career mobility and moving within or to particular regions. So you can look at basically the gap here in this diagram between movers and non-movers. It's interesting to note that everywhere apart from in the West Midlands, movers have much higher rates of upward occupational mobility. than non-movers. And perhaps in the conversation afterwards, we can kind of look at some of the geographical areas here. So we can see big differences for places like Scotland, or the east of England. London, as we'd expect, has got that difference too, but perhaps it's a bit more modest than we might have expected beforehand. That's a very brief run through of our analysis of understanding society in terms of social and spatial mobility. In terms of things we might want to try and highlight as key findings, about a tenth of the population changes address every year. 4/5 of this group remain within the same occupational group as they did before they moved. About a tenth of those movers experience upward occupational mobility, and about a 20th of those movers experience downward occupational mobility. So indeed, movers are much more likely than non-movers to be occupationally upwardly mobile, but they're more likely in some cases, in many cases, to be downwardly mobile. Another key point I would like to make is that spatial migration isn't experienced evenly for population subgroups and across different places. So as we perhaps expect, as I've said already, men gain a lot more from mobility, spatial mobility in terms of their careers than women do. Likewise, people who are well educated, people who are younger, gain much more from moving than older people or people with fewer qualifications. And from a geographical perspective, perhaps surprisingly, east of England and Scotland seem to have bigger differences between movers and non-movers in terms of career outcomes. That maybe relates to that earlier point I made about multiple escalators within an economy as opposed to just one. Excuse me. So that's kind of a very brief run through of kind of our analysis of understanding society. And of course, whenever we do research like this, inevitably, as intellectually curious people, these sorts of studies raise more questions than they answer. What I think I'll do now for perhaps the last 5-10 minutes or so is perhaps try and think forward in terms of social mobility, spatial mobility, trying to think about some sort of research agendas in that particular area. So try to identify four themes here and two methodological perspectives we might try and focus on going forward. So first of all, we've all lived through the last few years of COVID. Post-COVID, hopefully, what will the changing geographies of home and work mean for social mobility? We can think about people moving less frequently. What does that mean for social mobility? What does the levelling up agenda and other place-based policies mean for social mobility? And then finally, we can think about intergenerational support and how that might play in to inequalities going forward. In terms of methodologically, we can ask some questions about longer-term perspective and also thinking about different outcomes of spatial mobility beyond basically wages and career status. So in the first point, we can think about COVID-19 and basically perhaps fracturing this long-standing relationship between where someone lives and where they work. So thinking back over 10,000 years since the development of early agricultural systems, there's always been a close proximity between where someone lives and where someone derives their livelihood. For some groups, usually higher socioeconomic status groups, things like transport developments, information communication technology developments have loosened that relationship to an extent. So that was already happening to an extent. Of course, with home working, remote working in the context of the pandemic, that's really kind of perhaps fractured this really long-standing relationship between where someone lives and where someone works. What does that mean for things like social mobility? In terms of geography, we can think about so-called winning and losing spaces because of this new geography of home and work. So a classic example might be thinking about city centres. More and more people are working remotely. Then, of course, demand for living in inner city areas might well decrease. That kind of implications for certain places. We can also think about places which are perhaps winning through these new processes. These might be aesthetically appealing locales, coastal areas, rural areas, which are able to increasingly attract higher socioeconomic groups work in these places. But of course, that has some negatives as well in terms of housing affordability in these types of areas. Another thing to point out would be social inequalities in remote working. So for white collar workers, remote working is much more possible than it is for people in customer facing roles and blue collar occupations. So we'll go with this changing geography as a consequence of COVID, we can see basically winning and losing groups and winning and losing spaces as well. That's emerging. What does that mean in terms of social mobility? Perhaps then if people work remotely increasingly, that maybe loosens the extent to which spatial mobility is a catalyst for social mobility. On the plus side, it means that some places perhaps are able increasingly to attract and retain human capital. But we can also think about the extent to which remote working is beneficial for some people's careers, but damaging for others. So early evidence is emerging that for others, for example, working from home actually doubles their burden in terms of caring responsibilities and paid work responsibilities as well, whereas that isn't the same extent for men. So we can think about a lot of changing geographies of home and work, and that having potentially quite significant implications for social mobilities going forward. Another thing which is interesting to perhaps look at is the extent to which rates of internal migration are declining in many high-income countries. There's some tentative evidence to suggest it's happening in the UK and many other high-income countries too. We can think about various drivers of that. For example, demographic change. Most societies are aging. That means that older people are much less likely to move than younger people. We can think about economic uncertainty. Even before COVID crisis, people were moving less in the context of austerity and flatlining living standards. That means less residential mobility. And then finally, there's the idea, identified by Tom Cook, this idea of secular rootedness, that basically perhaps in a globalized world where everything's increasingly the same, perhaps people have a desire for connection with communities and local places. Arguably, that's been exacerbated probably by COVID as well. So people are moving around less often. Perhaps going forward, that means that perhaps maybe the relationship between social and spatial mobility again might be fractured to an extent. And if it isn't fractured, then perhaps we might need to be concerned about social mobility, because people moving around less often means less opportunity to move up socially as well. So that's another thing we might want to be concerned about in research going forward. Another important factor I thought, which was worth looking at, was basically the levelling up agenda, the return of place-based policies to the kind of the policy arena, again, which is really interesting from a geographical point of view. And I suppose kind of the key debate here, the long-standing debate, is basically is it better to increase the mobility of skilled people towards the places which offer the best opportunities for career progression, or is it better to redistribute opportunities for career progression more evenly across the country? Whenever I was thinking about this talk, I was reminded of two kind of really quite controversial pieces about 10, 15 years ago. First of all, by the Policy Exchange, and then secondly by The Economist. I'll just read this little box, so you can read it yourself. And these were kind of quite really interesting, I thought, in the sense that they were very much about basically, giving up on certain places and kind of promoting the mobility of more skilled workers away from these places towards more productive parts of the economy. And of course, that's a highly controversial point of view. More recently, you're all familiar, I'm sure, with the levelling up, and the white paper was published last month. And kind of a key aim here is supporting people to realise their career aspirations without having to leave their communities. So that hints at this idea of a redistribution of opportunities across the country. And within this report, you can have a look at it. It's easy to find online. There's quite a few interesting kind of statistics which were kind of quoted. So you can see here the stats for people who change address between the ages of 16 and 27, and basically a third of graduates move, and the equivalent figure for non-graduates is less than half from that. So you can see again, fitting with what we found in our analysis of understanding society, we see that people with more skills are much more likely to move and much more likely to benefit from moving than people with fewer skills. However, in the report, it also identifies the trend that perhaps graduates, like other population subgroups, are becoming slightly less mobile over time. In the report, it talks about overheating housing markets, unaffordability of housing in places like London and the Southeast, perhaps being a driver of graduates being less mobile than they were in the past. And again, if we think about the outcomes of this, we can think about benefiting some more economically peripheral areas in the sense that they're able to retain more of their human capital. On the negative side, we can perhaps think about if people who are highly skilled are less able to move to places which helps them to maximize the benefit from that, then that perhaps in the short term at least leads to losses of productivity for them and for the economy more generally. Some really interesting ideas there around levelling up and place-based policies. So it's kind of it's intriguing and it's exciting to see that kind of coming back into policy debates again. Another thing which was quite interesting in that report was basically this image here, which was showing basically mobility of graduates. And perhaps maybe whenever I was looking at this data, maybe perhaps reflect on the extent to which we're maybe guilty of fetishizing London or resculator regions in terms of mobility. So I think I would admit that I'd probably have this idea of skilled people, skilled young people, graduates, basically everyone moving to London that don't live there already. But if you looking at these images here, you can basically see that indeed London does attract graduates from rural areas, from second-order cities, but only about a quarter of graduates are residing in London. Likewise, in terms of where people move, graduates are moving, about a quarter of them, seem to move to London. Many graduates are going to other cities, major cities, rural areas as well. So perhaps it's quite simplistic to think about this idea as kind of the global city or the escalator region being a magnet for all talent within the economy. These images would perhaps suggest something different going on there. Another issue which I thought was maybe worth reflecting on going forward was thinking about less of a focus on perhaps intergenerational inequalities, which has been the focus of this talk so far. I'm thinking a bit more about intergenerational inequalities and support and how that might pan out in terms of social mobilities. So of course, it's been a remarkable achievement of human society so far that each generation has tended to do better than the previous one in terms of living standards. However, increasingly there's concern around millennials and perhaps the generations which follow, perhaps not being able to have the same living standards as their parents at the equivalent age. And this is perhaps remarkable, especially remarkable, given that millennials so far are probably the most educated generation in history. So, some people have kind of referred to this at the risk of hyperbole as kind of this impending age of intergenerational conflict because of these basically generational differences in people's life chances. And of course, we can think about this controversially, perhaps being exacerbated by things like COVID, where younger people perhaps sacrifice their chances to protect the health of older generations, or Brexit, where younger people are much more favour of Remain, and older people who tended to vote in favour of Leave. In terms of thinking about the inequalities agenda in this, we can think about housing wealth being a main determinant of inequalities within the UK and elsewhere. Wealth is much more unevenly distributed than income, and this kind of has significant implications in terms of social and spatial inequalities. So older people tend to hold a lot more housing wealth than younger people, and places where property prices are higher would have a lot more wealthier people, places which have lower property prices. We can see about social and spatial inequalities there. And if we're thinking about how this translates into implications for social mobility, if we think about intergenerational inequalities, of course, therefore, that means that some older people, whether it be parents or grandparents, are able to promote the social mobility of their children or their grandchildren by investing in their education. And of course, education is a main determinant of social mobility, or in housing, in the sense that escalator areas are overheating in terms of affordability. So if they can help their children or their grandchildren to be in those buoyant labour markets, that'll help them those people to achieve social mobility to a greater extent than people who don't have that intergenerational support. That's perhaps a really interesting kind of research agenda thinking forward as well. So I'll finish now by mentioning two kind of maybe methodological developments I might think about going forward. First of all, we can think about a longer term perspective. So an opportunity there might be to combine census-based longitudinal studies with longitudinal survey data. So what we're trying to do next in our analysis is take the NLS from 1971 up until 2011, and then basically add in our analysis of understanding society, give us a really long, detailed perspective of how patterns and processes of social mobility have changed over time. We can also think about area-based measures in terms of what impacts, in terms of outcomes of spatial mobility. So conventionally, we tend to think about people moving to certain places, and we look at their career outcomes as a consequence. And of course, that's a perfectly rational thing to do. But we can also think about outcomes in terms of the types of places that people are moving to. We can think about there is levels of deprivation in those places, how affordable or otherwise are the places they move to, and also looking at basically levels of well-being in these particular places. And related to that point, in terms of outcomes of spatial mobility, in terms of careers, as I was saying, conventionally we focus on occupational outcomes, on income as an outcome variable as well. But can also perhaps think about subjective financial well-being and income satisfaction as well. And of course, using a data set like Understanding Society is really valuable in this respect, in that it contains attitudinal information, and basically information on how people reflect on their financial circumstances. But just to kind of reiterate very briefly some of those points. First of all, we can think about basically outcomes of mobility in terms of the types of places that people are moving to. You can see basically this mosaic image here, basically showing that whenever people move in terms of moving upward, in terms of occupational mobility and spatial mobility, there's a fairly even split in terms of people moving to kind of better or worse areas. Likewise, for people who move downwards in terms of occupation after they move, you can see a fairly even split in terms of people moving to more or less deprived areas as well. So perhaps what we can think about here is, in terms of escalator regions, people moving to a particular place for the purposes of having better career outcomes, but in terms of their residential circumstances, perhaps having to move to less desirable areas as well. So there's maybe some interesting areas to think about that as well. We can also think about, and this is some of our analysis of Understanding Society too, thinking about this question I referred to a moment ago of intergenerational inequality. You can see basically here levels of satisfaction with income and how that compares by different age groups. Maybe three things here worth remarking upon. Older generations much more financially comfortable than younger generations, and perhaps maybe an exacerbation of this trend through time. So perhaps that kind of ties in with that point I made a moment ago about perhaps an impending age of intergenerational conflict, or perhaps intergenerational transfers having particular implications for social mobility for certain groups. And then this is the final slide before I wrap up. So far, I've been talking about outcomes in terms of occupational change, how that kind of is associated with geographical mobility. I just thought it'd be worth kind of showing these images at the very end, which basically perhaps kind of emphasize the risk of focusing on career outcomes with mobility. So you can basically see this is the Office for National Statistics, which have tried to look at levels of life satisfaction, happiness, and anxiety across the UK. Of course, this predates COVID. They can see that basically these maps show the happiest parts of the UK don't necessarily be the wealthiest or the most productive, or the places which attract. That's perhaps maybe an interesting thing to take away from the talk as well. What matters more: happiness, well-being, or financial gain from mobility. Okay. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to discussing perhaps some of these points with you at the end. Thank you.